Hello and welcome to Undercommon Taste. This is a podcast where we create and discuss homebrew content for tabletop RPGs.
Something wicked this way comes.
Now that's not a very nice thing to say about my friend James.
Well, probably not. Well, there are people that changes that. There are shapeshifters. There are people that can change identities or hide things. I don't know.
Anyway, I'm Ian Woodworth. I'm joined by my co-host James Daly, and today we are joined by an old friend of mine, a college friend of mine, one Miss Kelly West. Because last episode we talked about the Old Gods of Appalachia role-playing game, and we got to the end of the episode and we wrapped up recording, and I had that realization that, we talked an awful lot about the cipher system, but we didn't talk very much about Appalachia as a setting.
We did not.
And so, James being an adult transplant, and me being someone who grew up here but ain't from here, I had that need to have somebody that I knew who was from here.
Very fair. Very, very fair.
To add that element to the conversation, and Kelly is very much a from here kind of person. So Kelly, welcome to Undercommon Taste. It's nice to actually get to talk to you again. It's been a hot minute.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it has been a while since we went to college.
Yeah, and so
I think
Kelly
she just called you old.
It's fair. It's fair. Kelly and I are both parents of single girl children, so we have not a lot of time.
Nope, not at all.
And Kelly, you were actually a player in my first ever attempt at running an RPG. It was when we were playing Paranoia in the basement of Ratliff Hall at Tech.
Yes, I remember that.
And it didn't go so well. I mean, it was functional for a first attempt, but it wasn't very good.
Well, they say that the first step at being great at something is being willing to be terrible at something.
That is true.
And people that want to DM that get into it, because I know there's a lot of people who either, are hesitant to get into tabletop gaming in general, or particularly running their game and DMing. You're probably going to be bad your first handful of times, but that's how you learn. And if it's your first time and you're with veteran players, I'm sure they're going to be supportive and be able to give you tips. And if it's your first time DMing or playing and you've got all new players, well, everyone's equally terrible and they're probably not going to notice.
Hopefully. And another important detail to note is that most of the time, whenever we are recording, I do a pretty good job of turning down the drawl, but I have a feeling, given this particular episode's conversation, it's probably going to slip out a bit. It's probably going to come out tonight.
I can't wait to see the mask drop a little bit. That'll be fun. Me, I just mimic, so we'll see.
Yeah.
I think that might be an interesting point to start the conversation if you're up for it, because
absolutely,
I don't particularly sound Appalachian. Not anymore, anyway.
Yeah, and that's something that, I didn't have a need to unlearn it because, my family is originally from Connecticut. I first learned to speak in Connecticut. I had that Yankee New England accent as a little kid, which, as you can imagine, did not do me any favors through elementary school. But whenever I got out of the area, and I guess I didn't really get out of the area if you're talking about Appalachia as a whole, but, going from Southwest Virginia, where I grew up, to West Virginia, and then later to Charlottesville, which is Central Virginia, I didn't really have a need to try to unlearn my accent or mask my accent. I didn't really have a whole lot there initially to deal with.
I like how this conversation has turned because, again, we aren't talking about the Old Gods of Appalachia as a setting and a game. And again, for the game, this is an Eldritch horror game. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the podcast is amazing. But a lot of it is kind of remembering that thing that we have all forgotten about. And as an adult transplant to the region, I have heard many adults talk about where as children, they grew up with that Southern drawl or that thick twang, and either in school or parents, they were taught to try to mask or unlearn that because other people in a quote, quote, professional setting or an academic setting would not take them as seriously, or they were perceived not to be taken as seriously with that drawl. And so it's something that they've tried to either mask or unlearn, as Ian and Miss Kelly have talked about. And when we talk about old gods of Appalachia, we're talking about people that were here again in the time, or people coming back, and those stories and those remembered histories that people thought about and passed off as just myth and old wives' tales, but having a very real something to them. And suddenly needing to remember those old stories, the old family lore. And so, I mean, how much more of that is, this is the way we spoke. We spoke with inflection and intention and meaning.
Yeah, and with the accents that have gone away, and the Appalachian accent varies not just state by state, region by region, but holler by holler. With the loss of, the way of speaking, you lose parts of the manner of speaking. You lose turns of phrases, you lose inflections that make sense when you're saying certain phrases. So listening to Old Gods, because I admittedly only just got into it. My boyfriend from Pittsburgh, we went through Granny Whitetail with Glorianne.
Okay.
Build Mama Coffin. We just went through that this weekend.
Okay.
And they speak mostly like North Carolinians, and they reference a lot of North Carolina and Kentucky and some Tennessee things in that story from where I was coming from. There are differences even. So I'm from Central West Virginia, and they're just even culturally speaking, like we're still Appalachia, but there's still some differences. So even listening to Old Gods for me, I get new takes on this folklore that are really interesting to me.
So linguistically, I mean, I personally am fascinated by the study of linguistics. And my first couple months in East Tennessee, when I first moved here, I actually worked for a call center for a short while. And there was a lady that worked next to me. And it was fascinating because she could talk to a person on the phone or just anywhere, and she could tell you what state they were from and generally what portion of the state they were from just by their accent and the words they used, because the linguistic diversity here is so very wide, because you did have areas that were largely cut off from each other for long periods of time. The roads here were not heavily developed until later. So it was more difficult even to get, across state lines to like Tennessee to North Carolina. Even now it's a couple miles, but it takes an hour and a half and you got to go over the mountains to get there. These communities are not, I don't want to say isolated, but they are relatively remote. And so you do get a lot of diversity and different things pop up, which again, linguistically is just like, if I was a linguist, I would be in heaven studying all the different little nuances.
Yeah. And I appreciate you talking about, which portions of Appalachia the different elements of the different stories are coming from, because it makes a whole lot of sense given that, Cam is from Bristol, and I'm pretty sure that Steve is from, I think, Boone or Asheville, North Carolina, there in that general area. So it makes a lot of sense that they would be pulling a lot of that into the story. I don't subscribe to the Patreon, so I haven't had an opportunity to listen to Blackmouth Dog and Build Mama Coffin yet. I've only listened to what's gone out on the free stream. That will probably happen at some point, but I haven't listened yet, so I don't know the content of the stories that you've listened to.
I've heard a couple of episodes from, I think, the main free storylines, so I'm familiar with the green and, the dark? And
the green and the inner dark.
Yeah, and there was a trial that happened under a mountain or in a mountain.
Yeah, that was the most recent season.
Yep, so I caught a couple episodes of that in the car. But yeah, there are definitely themes that are present, but, I specifically, whenever I hear a lot about haints, and this is just in pop culture too, but also a little bit in some of the narrative from Old Gods, that comes from the Gullah Geechee people. That word does, referring to, spirits and ghosts, and that did not make it up to West Virginia. So, like I said, it's interesting hearing the vernacular and the specific words chosen for Old Gods.
So West Virginia-wise, what were some of the urban myths or old lore that, community stories and things like that surrounded that you grew up with?
So West Virginia is really unique because you mentioned we could be 2 miles away, but it could take an hour to get between the two locations. And West Virginia is a really diverse area. We have the Appalachian Mountains going up primarily the eastern part of the state, up and through the thumb of the eastern panhandle, up to the northern tip and above. So the eastern panhandle is more Virginia. Once you get over the mountains, you're almost right in DC. So you have that area is super influenced by Virginia, Maryland, DC. That's where Harper's Ferry is. So John Brown and John Brown's Ghost and all of the ghosts at Harper Ferry are super popular there. I'm not sure much more of the local stuff there because that's far away from me. For instance, I have to go either north to Morgantown and then over on 68 to get there, or drive south down to Beckley and then go north through Virginia to get to the eastern part of the state. And it's a very long drive either way.
Yeah.
The southern part of the state are the coal fields, and you come in with more recent tales from mine wars, but then you have the Hatfields and McCoys, and you get more of the more southern Appalachian, or going really into the heart of Appalachian folklore.
Now, were the
And you
Hatfields and McCoys from West Virginia?
They're in that area of very southern West Virginia and western Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky. I meant to say Eastern Kentucky.
Okay.
Where they come together, yeah.
I always thought they were more Ozark, so that's because my family, relative on my dad's side, I mean, I grew up in Central California, but my dad's side of the family came from like Oklahoma, near the Ozarks. And so like we know about the Hatfield and McCoys over there even, so I always thought they were more Ozark. So actually that is something new to know, that they were from closer to the Appalachia region.
No, they are Appalachian. So the McCoys lived in Kentucky, and the Hatfields lived mostly in West Virginia and Mingo County and Logan County.
Oh, awesome.
So those are the Hatfields are, West Virginia. That is straight Appalachian folklore. Or
Awesome.
not even folklore, but
that's still history. But yeah, no, I love that.
So you're still mountainous down there, but the mountains are getting more spread out and not as narrow and deep. When you get to the western part of the state, you're going into the Ohio Valley, and the hills are disappearing and they're turning into rolling foothills and flatland. You get more Midwestern culture there, Midwestern folklore, and then the central and northern part of the state are deep in the nooks and the crannies of the Appalachians, where, for me, where I grew up, the portion of the sky that I could see from my home deep in the holler was between about 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. If you look up and put your hands about like that, that was the narrow strip of sky that I could see at home. So we had a lot of darkness even during the summer, and that kind of lends itself to more spooky tales. But we had mostly ghost stories and, the things that are outside in the darkness. You just don't go out after dark. And a lot of that blended with fear of the dark and immigrant folklore, and in part Native American folklore as well. Like if you hear your name in the dark, you do not respond.
No, you didn't.
Yeah. If something says your name, no, it didn't.
Yep. So, for instance, whenever my grandmother was a girl in the 20s and 30s, I think, there were still settlers feuding with bands of indigenous people. We don't know if they were displaced indigenous people or if they were actually indigenous to the land, like that specific land, but there were still feuds. And there's a lot of blended culture folklore, specifically where I'm from. And I think that might make it a little bit more unique. But you get that kind of folklore really all over the state. You just have to ask the right people and ask the right questions.
Right. And one thing that I learned whenever I went to school in West Virginia was the level of cultural diversity that you had coming into the state of West Virginia. Because down here, Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, Western North Carolina, this area was settled primarily by British, Scottish, Irish, the British Isles individuals, whereas West Virginia, because of the booming coal industry, especially in the mid to late 1800s and into the early 1900s, you had lots of German immigrants, you had lots of Italian immigrants coming into the area to work in the mines.
Yeah.
And so they brought a lot of their own culture from continental Europe that we in this area at Northeast Tennessee don't have. I mean, it's why, pepperoni rolls are a big thing in West Virginia.
Yep,
Fair.
I grew up eating my great-grandma's souse. But that same great-grandma also taught me how to eat with my hands because she was taught by her father and grandfather to eat with her hands.
Well, that's awesome.
For me personally, it was a very blended experience.
And that is one of the fascinating things with this region is you do get a lot of that blended experience. And again, going back to if we're using this region for a game setting, particularly something like Old Gods of Appalachia, I really do love the reference that I made last week to Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where people brought a lot of those deities and those stories here with them. But as people kind of got into modern life, a lot of them were forgotten. So they're not fully here, but they're not completely disappeared either. And you can use a lot of these things for your stories if you do a Monster of the Week type style, or just use them as a backdrop for the what's going on. Another thing you talked about, the coal mines. So among the lore of the Appalachians and the facts that I love is that the Appalachian Mountains are older than animals. People say the mountains are older than bones. So it kind of gives you this time frame. When I did an internship last summer with the Natural History Museum, I had some fossils, and some was these plants called calamites, and there's these fossilized plants that are what coal comes from, basically. And these people came from Kentucky, and they talked about where people were strip mining the mountains for coal and what other minerals they can get. They would get these fossils that just piled up, and because it's not a mineral resource, they just heap them up and leave them there as waste, and anybody could run up and grab them. So these people had like a whole mantle place full of fossils that they've just picked up off the side of the road. So how easy would it be to wake up something or discover something long since put to sleep or forgotten that, yeah, you're strip mining this mountain, and now it's upset that you woke it up?
Yeah. So the Appalachian Mountains were at one point much larger and much taller. And over their extremely long lifespan, those caverns collapsed. You can go walk around in one in Virginia called Burke's Garden. It's really fascinating because you're in this beautiful valley and it's wooded, and you can see the ridges on either side, except that those aren't quite ridges. That is the sides of the mountain that would have peaked far above you
Oh,
in this
wow.
giant cavern. But now there's just open air because it all collapsed.
Oh, that's crazy.
That's why the Appalachians are small. They're smaller mountains, and there's a lot more valleys and stuff because everything has eroded and collapsed over a very long time.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find really interesting is that if you just draw a line, you can see that the mountainous areas of Southern Ireland, the Hebrides in Scotland, up into the fjords, and the mountains up in Norway and Finland and Sweden that go up along the side of the was it the Baltic Sea?
Yeah.
That's all part of the same mountain chain.
Yes. So from a historical perspective, the Appalachians were formed as the supercontinent Pangaea was forming. So before Pangaea was Pangaea is when the Appalachian mountain range initially, I forget the words, it's not erected, it's accreted. I forget exactly what the geological term is, but that's when the mountains were formed before Pangaea was Pangaea. And then as Pangaea separated out to the plates as we have them today, yeah, it's split up. So yeah, those mountains have suffered some erosion. There's definitely been some wear and tear. There's all kinds of things that could lurk that are ancient and unknown.
When 1 billion years old you reach, look as good you will not.
Exactly.
If I can do a slight spoiler for that Patreon episode, do we mind?
I don't care, yeah.
Spoiler warning ahead. Okay, go.
Granny White represents hunger.
Ooh.
She eats and she eats and she eats and demands offering and sacrifice, but she is eternal hunger embodied. And to me, that is what I want to see more of, or the big bad, or
Yes.
or the omnipotent presence of evil that we really don't want to confront because they're that big and old, is something like that.
No, that is a perfect big bad. And something like, again, because Old Gods of Appalachia, it is an eldritch horror. So the driving force behind everything, your players may not even encounter, but what they're going to encounter is the things that this driving force is going to affect around it. Why the landscape and the people and the nature around it is changing. And yes, this force of hunger is absolutely a driving force. Trying to think, Again, this would hit the far northern range, but the Wendigo, generally from the Algonquin, the Iroquois. The Algonquins were made of several large groups of indigenous and First Peoples, as were the Iroquois. They were like 6 or 8 groups that kind of formed a super community. But that's not the creature that you generally see like in Stephen King's Pet Sematary or even most online art now. It has changed significantly, but the Wendigo was this force of hunger and selfishness that was never ever sated. I actually did a paper on it for one of my finals for an art class. A lot of Native people now are taking the Wendigo as that like ever hunger selfishness and making this like a force of addiction, saying that the addiction acts like the Wendigo and it takes people away. And again, unfortunately, with the Appalachian, we did have like the opioid epidemic and other things like that too. So this is another one of those things that kind of reflects in the region that you can put a shadow or a shade over the game and like, this is the driving force behind everything. And now here's the chain reaction of events that your players have to encounter or deal with.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, like West Virginia doesn't have a lot of well-documented Native presence because there was just a lot going on. And we did have tribes that were reabsorbed into other neighboring tribes, but we had Algonquin, Iroquois speaking, we had Sioux, we had Shawnee. The Monotom people were either Shawnee or Sioux, and then they were absorbed by other tribes, and they disappeared in like the 16 or 1700s. But I could talk about that for forever because that's a special interest of mine.
Oh, please do. I mean, again, because that does lend to, again, the history and the lore of the region is like, okay, why did these people disappear? Where did they go? Were they happy about disappearing? I mean, again, you have something as simple as, not to trivialize things, but you have, what is it? The curse of the Bambino, because Babe Ruth lost or was traded before a game. You have like the goat curse with it. So, I mean, we confer curses in these string of events for something as trivial as that. How much because you're losing your homeland or your people are disappearing and you want some sort of revenge, either be a Native American First People tribe or even just within a family. Maybe the railroad or a union company did a family wrong and they had old family magic and they've set up a curse for revenge, and that leads a chain reaction going through. I mean, again, just the possibilities for lore are amazing in this region.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be done. Speaking of greed and the Wendigo, it makes me think a lot of coal barons because that's a prominent theme in Appalachia. A lot of modern towns in West Virginia, specifically in the south central area, they were established entirely as coal towns, like Ian mentioned, going back into the 1800s. And these used to be booming places, booming cities at the time. And eventually, things change, but the mines shut down or they change hands, they start running dry for whatever reason. These towns turn into ghost towns. My entire home county was based on essentially one coal mine, and at some point had multiple thousands of people, almost 10,000 or more at some point, I think. Now they're down into simple thousands. The mine opened up, shut down, changed hands. The county is a food desert. So there are really interesting, we'll call them remains, of the original mines, really deep into Clay County. There are segregated cemeteries from way back in the day that still exist. There are giant trees. There's one particular tree was a hawthorn tree, sycamore tree. I can't remember. It was virgin timber, and it was a massive, massive tree that some local pagans had held in reverence because for some reason folks had left this one tree.
Oh, wow.
And it's in this old mining camp area, and it was eventually starting to die, and some well-intentioned practicing folks brought their candles to said dying tree and caught it on fire.
Oh.
And this once massive tree, like if you've seen photos of, settlers in the old logging expeditions, specifically in Appalachia, there were some trees that might have rivaled redwoods on the West Coast.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yeah. So this particular region where we are living, timber was the predominant product here. We're a little bit too far east for the big coal seams where we are at. But there was a lot of timber in here. And when I was in high school, I did 4-H forestry judging. And so we went to different places to, practice identifying trees and whatnot, and you would see pictures where they had cut these trees and every bit of 35, 40 feet in diameter.
Nice.
I mean, just massive elms and chestnut trees. Just, trees that the species themselves are now basically extinct or entirely extinct, predominantly because initially they logged out all of the virgin timber, and then the various diseases came across from Europe and wiped out the rest.
Yeah, that does unfortunately happen. That is definitely one thing I miss from California is I do miss the sequoias and the redwoods. And you see the trees out here. The forests out here are beautiful and dense. That is another thing that, like, as a transplant, again, I came from the Central Valley of California. It's largely a desert. It is flat. It is wide open. You get up into the Sierra Nevadas, and the woods are, you have the forests, and the forests aren't as dense, though, the way the trees and the canopy with the pines and the redwoods and things like that work. There's not much in the way of underbrush because there's a lot of what we call shade pruning. But out here, everything is so dense, and then you have the fun kudzu that was brought over, and that's growing everywhere. And at times, just driving down the road in the middle of the lush summer, I almost get claustrophobic because I feel like everything's kind of growing in on me. And it's like, dude, space. And just as an outsider, that's enough to make me feel uneasy. And so, again, talking about lore and stuff that may have come here from Europe, you have things like the Green Man, you have woods witches. Again, if you had like a great tree like that, you were talking about that hawthorn, and either someone well-meaning accidentally burnt it down, or if it was known to be a congregation point for maybe your less than stellar upstanding Christians, and they cut it down or burn it down in protest, again, that would set off a chain of events that would be a great story hook as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I also had a thought that I had penned.
Please.
So the interstate system was introduced in America in the 1980s, right? 70s and 80s?
50s.
It started in the 50s, yeah.
Sorry,
Eisenhower, yeah.
So it started in the 50s, but it made its way through part of West Virginia in the 80s. That's where I was going with that.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
That sounds right.
So I-79 was laid down in the 70s or 80s. And before that, for folks who wanted to get to Charleston, you had to take river roads. And I-79 now goes through some valleys. You can obviously see where mountains were blasted away with those long drill lines going down the cliff faces. That's where they've drilled down and stuck dynamite in and blew mountains to bits to lay down road. But otherwise, you're generally going to be going through naturally occurring valley. And you can find some pretty spectacular vantage points. And one of them happens to be right where I grew up. I'm related to everyone in the cemetery that's up there now.
Oh, wow.
A white church stands on this hill. And you can walk up to the very peak of the hill in the cemetery and look all the way down the valley. And it's a beautiful sight, beautiful vantage point. The church there is very old. I think it was built in the early 1900s at some point. But my dad has a box of fossils and pottery shards and arrowheads and other bits and pieces from whatever indigenous people used to camp there.
Oh, that's awesome.
And, because their presence was there so recently, it's hard to say. It's probably not ancient at all, but, there's no real way to tell. But colonialism in general, if you want to stick to the old gods era, because I think they have it set in the 30s, the 20s and 30s?
Late 20s into the 30s is predominantly where the story is right now. I think the beginning of the first season was earlier than that, like the 1870s to 1880s. But yeah, most of the story right now is happening in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, so even at that point, that was when my grandmother as a child remembered settlers fighting with indigenous people who were displaced. But that was also when a lot of these older churches were starting to go up, and, the white settlers and the landowners and homesteaders were making it known that they were here to stay.
Like I said, just the history of this area I find it absolutely fascinating. And you were talking about, the family cemetery plots, and that's something that I came across for the first time when I moved to Tennessee. I had never seen anything like that in Jersey or in Central California. But yeah, I mean, even where I'm at now, you'll be driving down the road and then there'll be like maybe a quarter acre or half acre that's just got, a bunch of headstones because it's someone's family plot and it's been there for 100, 150 years. Like I said, just the history in this area is extremely rich.
We also have a good bit of small, narrow caves. You'll even find people with mine shafts on their property where they privately mine.
Interesting.
So, those get flooded, they collapse. I believe there are some modern horror movies about people who go spelunking in Appalachia and they're albino monster people, living
What's the
down
name
deep
of that
in the caves.
movie?
Is that The Hills Have Eyes?
No, that happened out in like Utah, Nevada. That's
okay.
Yeah, Hills Have Eyes is a result of nuclear weapons testing.
Okay.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know
though.
exactly, because it's a group of like 4 women cavers.
The Descent.
The Descent.
Yes.
That was a good movie.
Yep. The Descent, I think, was set in North Carolina. But,
I believe so, yes.
But yeah, so that's another one that has potential for, whatever kind of monster or pseudo-monster you want to throw down there.
Yeah, no, I like that. Another thing, like as far as old folk tales and folk heroes for America, one of my favorite is John Henry. I always get confused with John Henry or Paul Henry. But John Henry, I believe John Henry was in West Virginia too, was he not?
Yep.
Yeah.
West Virginia's honestly most famous and probably most favorite son, but no one really wants to admit that firsthand.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, there are reasons. Yeah, but no, John Henry and, the establishment of the railways, and being a steel driving man. Again, I love me John Henry. Again, he was always my favorite. One of the things that I like talking about with my students now when we just get to discuss tall tales is that Paul Bunyan, John Henry, Pecos Bill, Johnny Appleseed, the theme with them is they were fighting industrialization largely. It was manpower and the spirit of people versus machinery. We do break away a bit from old gods with this, but if you look at where we're at now with AI and automation coming up, and we're having the same struggle now, like 150, 200 years later. And so I'm waiting for the next, set of folk heroes and tall tales to come up, fighting AI and fighting automation and fighting, no, people can do it better, damn it.
I was going to say, we already have the Deckers in Shadowrun, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm more of a street samurai person myself, so. So we've been talking a lot about the region and, thematic elements of the region as a whole. I want to take a little bit of time here at the end to talk a bit about the people that live here. Because the people who are native to Appalachia are a completely different breed than what you will find elsewhere. And Kelly, feel free to add to or correct me on my assertions here, but Appalachian people are predominantly stubborn.
Yeah.
So some might even say bullheaded, to the point where sometimes they do things against their better interests.
That's that good Scots-Irish heritage.
I wouldn't know anything about that, Ian. I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know, yeah. That's not something that rubbed off on me. No, not at all.
So, being raised in Appalachia, I was born in the late 80s, but being born in rural Appalachia automatically sets you a generation back. So, I am a solid millennial, but I tend to relate a lot more to Gen Xers and Gen Xer memes and stuff because we were just that far behind. But I grew up with the knowledge that, we are not only fighting the environment, but, we're kind of fighting the world. Everyone looks down on us blue collar folk because living in rural Appalachia, there is really only blue collar folk and then the people who profit from them.
Yeah.
At least that's how it was. And you are taught to be humble in yourself and the good hard work that you do with your hands and what you produce and what you cultivate for your family. And so not only are you fighting the area because our soil is hard to till. It's made
red
of mostly red clay. And it's dense and it's not nutritious, so
it turns to glue when it rains and it turns to bricks when it dries.
Yep. Every spring, whenever the snow melted and the first rains would come, if you lived near a creek, you put on your tall boots and you park your car on high land and you just prepare for the floods because that's part of life.
Because it's going to come. It's going to
We
happen.
don't. Yep, we don't get tornadoes. We don't get hurricanes. We don't get cyclones. Occasionally we get a tornado, but mostly it's floods. So
tornadoes, when they happen, tend to be pretty devastating because they get down in the valley and it just sort of amplifies everything, and it just makes a huge mess.
Yeah, and no one's prepared for it. That's not part of our
never
survival prep. But we tend to be more welcoming of all folks because if you choose to live here, then you are making the choice of hardship.
Yeah.
There is still racism. There is still bigots. There's still everything. But in my experience, which is, a white woman experience, I've seen a lot of all types and welcomed a lot of all types and been part of that welcoming culture. I was taught to punch Nazis, and that's what our great-grandfathers did and grandfathers did when they went off to the Great War and came back. That's another thing. If you want to get out, you're pretty much going to have to enlist or go to college, and there's no other way to get out, is what you're told here.
Exactly, yeah.
And even the people who do enlist and did enlist, they still came back. And a lot of people just, no matter where they go, where they leave to, they come back. There is a lot of small-townism everywhere in the state. It's taken my out-of-town significant others a little bit to adjust to how many people I know and see just out and about in the big city of Charleston, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. But we're taught to struggle. We experience the struggle of all sorts, not just the accent. I wasn't taught by my parents to get rid of the accent. Like, my uncle has lovingly been described as sounding like Goofy from Disney, and that's just how he talks, and he's that good-natured, right? But I dropped that because I called a friend from Baltimore in high school, and her mom was like, "Oh, you're Katie's friend from the South," just from hearing me speak and ask for my friend Katie on the phone. So that's when I knew. Not only did I need to learn how to code switch, but I needed to drop that accent and listen to how I was speaking. So I don't think I could get back to the way I used to sound, even if I tried. And I take that, I'm a little sad about that now, but I did what I needed to do to get to where I am. And I think a lot of folks who got out will say that. And I say that as someone who went 30 minutes down the road, down I-79.
Right, yeah. And I found that I didn't really pick up the accent until after I was out of college, personally. It was when I started working in a welding shop and I had to deal with the guys that I was working with every day. And I found myself sliding into the local dialect more and more as a way of fitting in and, being able to honestly more clearly communicate with the people I was working with.
Yeah.
Because
Speaking
that
local language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I still remember as a kid, my sisters and I would make fun of my dad for doing the same thing. Whenever we had to go out to the co-op and pick up a truckload of feed for the animals on the farm, he would slip into the local dialect and, we would rib him for it. And, yeah, it's just something that happens. You want to fit in. And I feel like this area in particular is one where it doesn't feel like an obligation to try and fit in. It's almost a courtesy.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. You are acknowledging that this is just the way it is. And so you are acquiescing to the local demands.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the "you ain't from around here," which
Exactly.
And I've heard that many, many a time.
Well, and that boils down to you're either choosing to live the hard life or you're benefiting from the people who are choosing to live the hard life.
Right.
And, it's not just a case of the haves and the have-nots, but the intent. And, I was raised, I didn't like to go hunting with my dad, but I did know how to shoot. And, I sat in the kitchen while all the women carved up deer that would go into multiple family kitchens.
Oh, yeah.
And that harvest time was an important part. It was a family gathering time, and that kind of community gathering to process food is a cultural thing that happens in every culture everywhere in the world, and that just happens to be ours.
Yeah, you did bring this up, and I did want to bring this up too, but I'm glad that gives me a really good segue. And you guys can both correct me if I'm wrong, but as an outsider, talking about the people of Appalachia, the people that I've seen, one common thread with this I do want to bring up too, but one common thread is they tend to live a lot closer to the land. They are more reliable. They're going to hunt more. There's going to be a lot more herbal medicine. They're going to kind of till. They're going to have their own family gardens. And if there is a need, if there is a catastrophe, or if someone in the group is in need, you talked about, the people coming from the outside just benefiting from those that work hard. It's because other than maybe the Amish, if you need a barn raised, if you need something, if something has gone wrong, I have not seen a community pull together as fast and as supportive as I've seen communities out here in Tennessee. That local community spirit is astoundingly strong.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've noticed with the people out here is, again, it kind of goes back to that living close to the land and a lot of that folklore, folk magic. So you'll have people that are fine, upstanding Christians, and they go to church and they'll denounce, anything that you would expect someone of the faith to denounce, and they'll still go out and they plant their summer gardens or their crops by the signs and by the stars and by, old astrology, old lore that comes from Europe that was brought over with the family, or from Native American lore. But there's a lot of folk magic woven into the lore that people just go by, horoscopes and knowing that, you're going to have problems with your feet, you're going to have problems with guts, things that you still find in the Old Farmer's Almanac, things like this, that again, that lore that is very magical at its roots is in everyday life here as well.
Yeah, my granny, or my mama, used to put out bowls of milk for cats that she didn't have. And that is old Irish tradition for the house brownies, for the house spirits to be happy with you. That's an offering to them. But It was for the cats. For the local cats in our holler.
Yes.
And, to go a little further on your point about, the people in this region are much closer to the land and all of that, that's primarily out of necessity.
Largely,
Appalachia is one of the poorest regions in the United States. And it's one of those things where even being not from here, I still grew up with you learn how to do it and you do it yourself with what you have, or you go without.
Yeah.
Yep. That's why the deer harvest was so important.
Absolutely, yeah.
And squirrels and turkey.
Yep, if it can go in the freezer or go in the pot. Yeah.
And I remember my first year at West Virginia Tech was fall of 2007. And that year was a terrible drought year. It was one of the driest years on record. And that first semester there, I worked down at the physical plant for work study. I rode on the trash truck and I helped the guys rake leaves and all of that stuff over the course of the semester. And listening to everyone talking about, because of the drought, the oak trees weren't dropping acorns. And they were like, it's going to be a lean harvest this year because the deer are starving. The squirrels are starving because there's no acorns for them to eat. That's the sort of thing that you don't hear about in other parts of the country, because in most other parts of the country, they're not that close to the wilderness.
Yep.
Yeah, no, like I said, this is absolutely a beautiful region. The people here are amazing. And if you're wanting to use it now, one thing I am a touch wary about, especially with Old Gods of Appalachia, is we don't want to turn that into something exploitive. You don't want to use the region as...
don't use it as a caricature.
Yeah, don't use it as a caricature. Exactly. But if you want to use this as a theme and a setting, again, the amount of lore, the amount of story here is so rich. It is so easy to fall into, haha, silly redneck. Because unfortunately that is, and even if you go through the area, that is still something you see a lot of people go and they embrace. And I have mixed feelings. If that's what they want to embrace, that's their choice. But there's so many stronger things to embody in this region, I feel. But again, I am an outsider. So maybe I'm missing something with that.
Well, speaking of redneck, that goes back to West Virginia too.
Yeah, it does.
That goes back to the coal miners unionizing. That goes back to the Battle of Blair Mountain.
Yes.
Redneck originally had a very different meaning than what a lot of the people today are trying to use it as.
Very true. Very, very true.
You're a redneck because you wore a red bandana.
Not because you were a yokel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that was an outsider rebranding to mean yokel
Yes.
later on as a smear.
Right.
Excuse me.
I think Old Gods as a podcast does a really fantastic job of representing, how we used to speak here and not creating a caricature out of it, like you said. And I think how they blend things and how they represent folklore and the fantastical elements are really, like I said, interesting. I am fully invested now, so I'm going to go back and listen to it all. I think if you would like a recommendation for reading or modern urban fantasy, there's an author named Charles DeLint who has a series of books set in modern-ish New England, but it blends the Irish fairy court that came over with immigrants with the native beings and spirits that were already here. So you have the Crow Sisters and Queen Maeve's court. And
That's DeLint.
Charles D.E. space L-I-N-T.
Excellent. I have some Audible credits.
Yeah.
And he also wrote a book called Svaha, which is cyberpunk, but a couple of natives made it super big, made big money, created a Starlink system for themselves that
Ooh.
is just above Earth. So whenever North America turns into a post-apocalyptic wasteland, there's like the 7 great nations or something have space links to each other, and they're all thriving
Oh, nice.
in their space stations.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
But I think Svaha was really respectful because he's a Dutch author. But I love urban fantasy, and this is still urban fantasy, just urban to the 1930s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the Depression, largely.
Yeah, and Gilded Age wasn't really a thing in most of Appalachia, which is
Because
also
again, money
interesting.
didn't come here.
Yeah, they took the money from here and they exploited the laborers here.
Yeah, the things that they have been doing in Central and South America over, the last 70 years, they figured out how to do that in West Virginia.
Fair.
My great-grandpa, who was born in the 1900s, so would have been a young adult at the time of Bill Obama coffin, he was a farmer. He saw the first Model A car drive through Clay County, West Virginia. The field, the cemetery overlooks up on that hill where I-79 now lays. He saw one of the first planes that ever landed in Clay County make an emergency landing there because that was his property or right near it.
Oh, wow.
He saw the moon landing, which he thought was a fake. First radio, first TV, black and white to color, cell phones. He lived long enough to see cell phones. He died whenever I was, I think, a freshman or a sophomore in high school, so the early 2000s. He was almost 100 years old. So if you're having trouble imagining that perspective and how you can relate to that, I just imagine those things in that order, that you have experienced those things, and just try to step back your understanding of technology and how you live your life currently. It was a whole different world.
Yeah, the amount of technological change that someone who lived from 1900s, like they lived 100 years, just lived through the 1900s, 1901 to 2000. The amount of technological and scientific change and cultural change is mind-boggling.
There was another RPG system too, Deadlands, I think. They did Deadlands: The Weird West. So that game system focuses on dystopian, but it's like 1800s, late 1800s, but it stretches everywhere and it still has fantasy elements. It was GURPS, I think.
Sounds right. I've not actually had a chance to play it.
I would recommend just reading into it because that can kind of help set some of the backstory, I think, or set some of what came before if you're looking to set a story in Appalachian 20s and 30s. Like, that's a wild concept to me, and I'm really intrigued by it.
All right. Well, we've been talking for a little over an hour, and we've had a good conversation going on. But I think if we are going to get it done, we need to go ahead and do it. One of the things that we like to do when we invite our guests on is to do a little thing that we call the Monster Mashup.
Yay!
And it's been a hot minute since we've gotten to do one. So, Kelly, if you are game and you have some dice, are you ready and willing to roll some dice with us?
Absolutely. I have my dice box right here.
Woohoo. I wasn't sure if we were doing that this week or not. I'm excited.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and start off with a D4 for locomotion.
All right, D4. We have a 1.
A 1.
Ooh.
It flies.
Okay. It is not bound to the earth.
Next is a D6 for what does it eat?
I rolled a 6.
A 6? Oh, this is an interesting one. It eats ephemera. So souls, psychic energy, magic, etc.
Bit fitting for the episode. I like it.
Yeah, so, like emotions.
Yeah, it
Like,
feeds on fear,
yeah,
sadness,
Ooh.
depression, greed,
anger.
anger. Yeah.
Let's do one more to get a little more of a feel for what we're going with here. Another D6 roll for size.
I rolled a 3.
A 3. It is medium, so it's roughly the size of a person.
Okay. So I'm thinking something like ethereal, perhaps, maybe something ephemeral in itself, like a spirit or like a fog, or I mean, it could be a physical thing too, depending on how else it turns out. But I think something that could wisp between things, something that's probably not easily seen or noticed.
Yeah, I have a good idea already.
Okay.
Let's keep going.
All right.
All right. Next is a D8 for social organization.
Rolled a 4.
A 4. Family. So matriarch plus patriarch plus offspring.
Nice. I'm still feeling this. Again, we've got like a haunted family, or, again, it could just be some sort of other critter. It could be bestial, perhaps. I don't know. But yeah, we have a lot of options to work with.
Yeah, and if we want to keep it, Appalachian in theme, family is a huge
Yes.
part of Appalachian life, but not just blood family. Found family is also a huge part
Absolutely.
of Appalachian culture. The people that you choose to associate with.
So one of the things I was kind of thinking about, and it's one of the local legends or personas around here, but the Sin Eater, like when a person died, they would invite the Sin Eater and they would like eat a meal off the person's chest to consume their sin so that they weren't taking it with them in the afterlife so they could get to heaven. But I mean, that right now would fit if you had a family of Sin Eaters or a group of Sin Eaters would be kind of interesting.
So I had that thought as well, but I also had the thought of an underground coal mine.
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
things happen down there in the dark. And there's also condensation. So if you have a mist or a fog or coal dust,
Oh,
that's feeding on the head miner and his guys.
okay. I like that.
Yeah.
So if it's a misty spirit of some sort feeding on the miners, I could see it feeding on things like fear because you're worried about a cave-in, any kind of, I'm sure there's a better word, but the dissatisfaction or uneasiness if they feel like they're being, because I mean, again, a lot of these mining companies bound people with the land with things like company script and stuff like that. They were basically like wage slaves, and so they were bound and they knew it. And they knew there was no escape. So you have that kind of despair and that resentment. I guess resentment is the word I was looking for. That
Desperation.
kind of desperation, yeah. So I'm wondering if this thing would also do something to generate this so it can grow its own food. So maybe it has some sort of mental link to the managers or the owners to push people to their limits to create that despair and resentment.
So I want to take this a slightly different way.
Okay.
I don't want this to necessarily be an antagonistic creature.
Okay.
I'm thinking, this is my initial thought, what if it feeds on fatigue? What if it is like a kind of like the kobold in German mythology, this, or the blue cap, this subterranean spirit that operates in these mines. Less the kobold, more the blue cap. The blue cap is a beneficial, think of the mine version of a brownie.
Yeah.
I like it.
That's kind of what they are. And they would, materialize sometimes as a blue flame, primarily in instances where there is an impending danger or, there's a cave-in and the miners would say that they followed this blue flame to get out.
Okay. I like that. I want to take instead of it being antagonistic, I like the idea. It still feeds off of the fear and the despair, but it literally consumes it and leaves the people with nothing but hope. And so while the people are trying to keep the people kind of depressed and pressed down, they go through the mine and this thing literally feeds off of it and it leaves them with just hope. So they are going to come out of that mine wanting to make changes, wanting to improve things.
I love that idea.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I like that too.
Okay.
So given our conversation, I'm going to say that we're going to go ahead and skip the next roll The next roll is for native environment. That's the biome that it is. And I think we are pretty set with what we have come up with so far, as this is an underground creature.
Okay, subterranean. I like it.
I think I'm just going to make that executive decision that
Good decision.
I'm good with it.
because I don't want to undo what we have just made, because that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and skip ahead to the next roll, which is going to be a D12 for method of defense.
D12. Method of defense. Got a 2.
A 2. It has a bite.
I think we can work with this because if it is a mist thing or like, again, it's like coal dust and fog, that bite could be like, it can get into the lungs and maybe that's what causes a cough or discomfort, or it could be biting cold. Maybe it chills things. If something's going down trying to dislodge this thing, obviously it's there. Maybe perhaps it's semi-symbiotic with the miners that work down there. Perhaps someone figures that there is something helping the miners, giving them spirit. So if they're going to go down to try to push it out or eradicate it, it is going to defend itself and it does want to stay with the miners. So yeah, I could see like, again, a bite in the lungs or maybe cold, even just abrasion and wearing down on the skin because, again, you've got a lot of granule and abrasive in the air.
Yeah.
So mining underground is hard labor, and you're going to experience a lot of actual physical fatigue, so muscle cramps.
Oh, yeah.
And those kinds of bites. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
That might be an option.
And then, also one of the elements that shows up a lot in and around coal seams is sulfur.
Yes.
And so sulfur has a very distinct smell to it. So that could also be an element of that. It's basically chemical warfare. It's trying to deter you, to drive you away before it has to interact with you physically. If you're not supposed to be there, or if it doesn't want you there.
I like that. What if we keep this ephemeral and so it does not bite physically? Maybe it takes a bite out of your memories and you forget what you're going down there for if it senses you are antagonistic or hostile. So maybe you will get lost in the mines because it took like, where's the entrance or what am I doing down here?
Yeah, that would work. Okay. Next up, and this could make things really interesting interpretation. Next is a D12 for creature type. This is going off of D&D creature types. 11. Interesting. It's a plant.
I like it. Again, we talked about like the Catamites plants and the fossils. You have that old, because coal is, it's a fossil fuel, but coal doesn't come from animal fossils. It's not animal materials. It is the old plants from before animals were on the earth. And so all of the coal is just fossilized plant material. So the fact that this ephemeral, slightly spiritual thing is attached to the subterranean coal seam makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's plant ghosts.
Yeah. Plant ghost coast to coast.
Oh no.
Okay. Next is a D20 roll for quirks.
Right.
13. This is appropriate for a coal mine. It digs/creates pitfall traps.
I love it. Yeah.
Appropriate. Yep.
So yeah, this is where if someone or something is coming down that it doesn't want or it thinks shouldn't be there, it's straight up going to just collapse the mine.
Maybe that's the biting. Maybe it bites at like mine supports or ground underneath to create those pitfall traps.
Okay, yeah. Like it goes after the timbers, not the people.
Yeah.
Because, a kindred, it remembers being a plant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even, like I said, even if it bites and chews up the rocks underneath to create, a ground drop or a small cave-in. Because, if it's there and mutually beneficial, if not symbiotic with the miners, I don't think you'd want to do a full cave-in unless there was a large group of people for it. But I think something smaller and targeted would make sense.
Yeah, and most of the accidents that you would hear about, that you would read about with regards to accidents happening within the mines as a result of a collapse, they were partial collapses. They were not these catastrophic full cave-ins. And, because the coal seams tend to happen in and around shale stone, when it collapses, when it shears off and breaks away, you get very sharp pieces.
Yeah.
And that's what tended to, slice and maim and kill people.
Which, I mean, it would affect a bite real easily as well.
I guess I had a thought for the bite also. So
Okay.
in this time, before the advent of electricity and running the electricity down into the mines, they carried lamps and they had headlamps that had actual fuel and actual fire in them.
It's calcium carbonate, yeah.
Yeah,
Or
carbide.
Yeah, carbide,
Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe something related to the fuel or wicks or the flame to
Yeah,
extinguish that
so
flame.
chemically that would go, they would mix that with water, and then it would create acetylene as a gas, and that's what they would use to light with their thing. And so a buildup and a snap of that would be very feasible, very easy to do, and would also affect the bite. It would be a small explosion physically, chemically, but yeah, no, I mean, you could do that and just have a small pocket for that to snap, and yeah, that would work.
And now I'm not going to suggest that we make this change.
Okay.
Because I like what we have so far, but given that we have effectively made a plant ghost, the introduction of light after millennia sealed away underground,
Ooh.
the plant is remembering sunlight, and it's almost like a photosynthesis thing.
Ooh, I like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. So yeah, just random chemical, explosions, combustion from calcium carbide or some other thing for that. And that small explosive pop could be its bite. Again, getting pockets of flammable gas in a mine full of mine dust. Absolutely
Yeah.
not unheard of.
Yeah. And I can see a story surrounding this now where this is some family having their little wildcat mine there on their property that they mine. And, this spectral entity that lives in the coal seam is able to, draw off of the light of their carbide lamp and is basically able to regrow.
Okay.
And so this family, they only take so much, they only take what they need from this seam, but the seam never seems to deplete itself.
Ooh, I like that.
And and then the hostility portion of it is when somebody else finds out about it
And they got the goose that
goes in where they're not supposed to be.
because they think they have the goose that lays the golden egg.
Exactly.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Okay.
I had a
All
thought
right.
if we wanted to make it turn vengeful, that instead of growing, it in fact finds out that now, because it is stone, it can't grow. It can't feed off.
Yeah,
light.
it's
And
it
grows angry.
becomes it becomes bitter because of what it has lost.
Do we want it bitter or do we still want it largely beneficial? Because again, it's there and it's feeding off the people, but it's also helping the people because it is consuming the thing that is keeping them.
Right. No, I absolutely love where you went. Mine was just running off on my...
Right.
I mean, we could have clans of these things and each one's different. Maybe that this is this particular family's or this small company's version of this thing. Because again, I mean, it's not like any species or any, culture. It's not going to be monolithic.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So now we make it weird.
Yay!
So if I could get a D100 roll, please.
Oh, love the dice roller for that. Roll 90.
90. All right, we've got... Well, I don't know how we're going to interpret this one. Number 90, smells like teen spirit.
I'm okay with this. I mean, have you smelled the teen recently? They have a funk. And if it's underground and you've got this odor, a lot of your miners, were old, but a lot of them worked from the time they were children, 5 or 6, because child labor laws weren't a thing at the time. So maybe it just has that funk of musty body odor to a point.
And additionally, teen spirit, there is that independent streak. There is that tendency to buck authority.
Yeah.
If it consumes fatigue and negative emotion, then you are left with the funk of, good of hope and fight and vigor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So maybe not as wild of a wild card as I thought it was going to be. So James, do you have your dice for the second roll, or do you want me to go ahead and take care of it?
I have a digital one, but I'll roll it.
Okay.
Let's see here. I've got a 37.
37.
In a row? Oh, wait.
Capable of surviving in extreme temperatures.
Again,
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep, checks out.
I mean, that's why it's not afraid to, just detonate a methane gas pocket way deep down, because it's going to survive that.
Yeah. They can soak it. No big deal. No, I like what we came up with. And of all things, I am terrible at naming things, but I do think I have a great name for this.
All right, let me run the recap real quick first.
Okay.
All right, so it flies, it feeds on ephemera, it is medium sized, it exists as a family unit, which I don't think is something that we really explored a lot, but it makes sense, especially in the context of the small mine, like the family mine,
Yeah.
that it would be a smaller group. It exists underground. Its primary method of defense is a bite. It is a plant creature type. It digs pitfall traps. It smells like teen spirit, and it is capable of surviving extreme temperatures. So, James, what is your idea for a name for this thing?
So again, this is a plant. It lived before people in large fields. It creates this feeling overall of well-being and hope. We should name this the Elysium.
I love it.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, that was fun.
That was fun. I love doing these.
And I'm glad that I put that caveat in as early as I did.
Yeah.
With, keeping it on the more lighthearted, beneficial side, because we do tend to make lots of nightmare fuel.
We do. This was absolutely a breath of fresh air. This was fun to make a beneficial, even philanthropic thing to a point. It felt pretty good.
Right, but it still has teeth. Both.
It does have teeth, yes.
Both, metaphorical and almost literal.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Kelly, for coming and talking with us today. Let's not take 7 years before we sit down and have another conversation.
Agreed. Thank you guys so much for having me. It was
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
It was nice to talk about home in a positive way.
Yeah. If you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas, please send us an email under commontaste@gmail.com, or come and join us on our Discord. You can find a link to our Discord as well as all of our social media links off of our website, undercommontaste.com. Since we recorded the last episode, we are officially no longer on Twitter.
Dun, dun, dun.
I finally had enough spoons the other morning to overcome inertia and actually delete our, I guess now, X account.
Yeah.
It is an X account.
Yes.
So we are now predominantly over on Blue Sky. I'm trying to get a little more active over there. I'm trying to rebuild our follower list. So if you want to come and follow us on social media, Blue Sky is where we are. Undercommontaste.bsky.social, I think, is the tag on that. We are also on TikTok, YouTube, and Twitch. Again, you can find links to all of those off of our website, undercommontaste.com.
If this is your first time listening, we're very happy you found us. You can find our other podcast episodes on your podcaster of choice. Just look up Under Common Taste. If you would like, you can join me also on twitch.tv/undercommontaste. I stream normally on Mondays and Thursdays. I am playing through both Darkest Dungeon and Neverwinter Nights. You can go catch our old videos that we have there. Our videos right now are staying up for about a week at a time. If you miss either Monday or Thursday, you can catch the videos that we've created that week. But we'd love to see you. As always, give us a rating and review. This helps increase our visibility and lets us know what kind of content you want to hear more of.
And one last thing before we go, Kat, who we had on back in January with the Solo But Not Alone 4 bundle over on Itch, has opened up for submissions for Solo But Not Alone 5.
Nice.
So if you are a game creator or even an aspiring game creator, this could be the impetus that you need to finish a solo game and submit it. Submissions are going through December 22nd. I will have a link to the Google form that you can fill out to submit your game to the bundle in the show notes. I am currently working on a game. I am in the middle of final edits and layout. It is called All Is Well With My Soul. It is a tarot-fueled solo journaling RPG about going on a pilgrimage. And I'm real happy with how it's turned out. And my hope is to have it done in time to have it in that bundle.
Awesome.
Anyway, now that that's out of the way, thank you one last time for listening, especially to me rant here at the end as my ADHD meds have worn off. Thank you once again to Kelly for coming and talking with us today. Stay safe, everyone, and we will see you again in 2 weeks.
Happy gaming.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Under Common Taste. Our theme song is Massacre Ann, written and performed by Mary Kroll and used with permission. You can find Mary online at marykroll.bandcamp.com or on Patreon at patreon.com/Dr. Mary C. Kroll. Our logo is by David Sutherland. You can find more of David's work on deviantart.com/David Sutherland or on instagram.com/Willex_73. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so stay safe, and we'll see you then.